Theodore Calloway rode into Pinyon Gap on a gray morning in late October with 3 weeks of trail dust on his coat and a paper in his saddlebag, proving he had never rustled a single one of Judge Holly's Meade's cattle. And the first thing he saw when he came around the bend of Main Street was a woman in a green traveling dress standing on the porch of his own trading post, directing two men to carry his ledger desk out the front door. "Set it down easy," she was saying, in a voice pitched clear and unhurried, the kind of voice that expected to be obeyed without needing to be raised. "That desk is older than either of you, and it will outlast both of you if you are careless with the legs." Theodore swung down from the saddle before the horse had fully stopped, and the animal sidestepped in protest. He crossed the street in long strides, boot heels striking hard against the frozen mud, and came up the porch steps 2 at a time. "That desk," he said, "belongs inside that store. So do I, as it happens, since my name is on the deed." The woman turned. She was younger than he had expected from the crispness of her voice, perhaps 26 or 27, with dark hair pinned beneath a small traveling hat and eyes the color of good strong coffee, steady and assessing. She did not step back from him, though he was a head taller and had not shaved since Trinidad. "Your name was on the deed," she said. "It is my name on the note now, Mr. Calloway, and my name on the lien, and by the law of this territory, until that note is satisfied, the store and everything in it belongs to me." "I don't know you," Theodore said. "No," she agreed, "but you knew my uncle. Ezra Wilcox held the paper on this building for 4 years while you paid it down slow as molasses in January. He died in September. I am Charlotte Wilcox, his niece and his heir, and I have been in Pinyon Gap 11 days settling his affairs, during which time your note came due and went unpaid, and I exercised my lawful right to take possession. I was in a territorial jail in Cimarron for 3 weeks on a charge that turned out to be a pack of lies," Theodore said, his jaw tight. "I sent word." "I received no word," Charlotte said, and for the first time something in her expression flickered, not quite doubt, but a narrowing of attention, the look of a woman recalculating a sum. "If you sent word, it did not reach me, or it reached someone who saw fit not to pass it along. Convenient for you." "Nothing about this has been convenient for me, Mr. Calloway. I came west to bury my uncle and settle his estate, not to run a trading post in a mountain town I had never heard of a month ago. But I do understand contracts, and I understand that a note 90 days delinquent, regardless of the reason, gives the holder lawful possession under the terms your own signature agreed to. I read every line of that paper before my uncle ever signed it, and so I assume, did you?" Theodore had signed it. He remembered the reading of it, slow and careful, because reading had never come easy to him, and he had made old Ezra Wilcox go through it twice. He had understood every word. He had simply never imagined the old man's niece would be standing on his porch with his desk in the street. "I want it back," he said. "The store. My home is the room behind it." "Then pay the note," Charlotte said, "and it is yours again, precisely as before. I am not in the business of stealing men's livelihoods, Mr. Calloway. I am in the business of honoring the paper my uncle left me, until such time as it is made right. With what money? Everything I had was tied up in the fall freight order, and the freight order is sitting in a warehouse in Trinidad because I was locked up on a lie." "Then I suggest," Charlotte said, and here, for just a moment, the coffee-dark eyes softened, not with pity but with something more like respect, "that you find a way to prove the lie, collect your freight, and pay your debt before the passes close for winter. Because after that, Mr. Calloway, none of us will be moving anything through this country until spring, and I doubt either of us wants to spend a winter glaring at each other across a counter that neither of us is certain belongs to him." He almost laughed, in spite of himself, at the dry precision of it. Almost. The men carrying his desk set it down in the frost-stiffened grass beside the porch, uncertain whether to bring it back inside or leave it where it stood. And for a long moment Theodore Calloway and Charlotte Wilcox simply looked at each other across the space between them, Two strangers who had each just discovered the other was going to be considerably more trouble than expected. By that evening, Theodore had a bedroll in the loft of Sanchez's livery barn, and a headache from trying to make sense of it all. He had ridden 300 miles in 9 days, once the charges against him were dropped, half of it through country already dusted with early snow, thinking of nothing but his own bed and his own stove, and the satisfaction of unloading a season's worth of trade goods before the Wolf Tooth Pass closed for the year. Instead, he had a woman from St. Louis, or wherever fine ladies with that kind of voice came from, sitting behind his own counter with his own ledgers spread in front of her, adding columns of figures by lamplight as though she had been born to it. He went back the next morning not to argue, but because there was nowhere else in town to get coffee that did not taste of boiled saddle leather, and because it was, whatever the law said about it, still the only place that felt like his. Charlotte was already awake, wrapped in a wool shawl over her dress, and she had, he noted with some irritation, made the coffee herself, and it was better than his. "I did not take your coffee beans out of malice," she said without looking up from the ledger. "I took inventory of everything, beans included, because that is what a note holder is obligated to do. There is an itemized list on the counter if you would like to inspect it for accuracy." "I don't much care about the beans," Theodore said, and poured himself a cup anyway. "Then sit down, Mr. Calloway, because I have a proposal, and I would rather make it to a man drinking coffee than a man standing in my doorway looking as though he wants to throw a chair through the window." He sat. It was, he privately admitted, his own chair. "There is a wagon train," Charlotte said. 12 families and a schoolteacher, gathered at the Ashcroft Ranch 8 miles south, waiting on someone with sense to guide them through Wolf Tooth Pass before the snow shuts it for the year. They are carrying winter supplies for 3 settlements beyond the mountains, flour and salt and seed grain and medicine. And if they do not cross in the next 10 days, those settlements will spend the winter starving, because the low road through the Kane toll gate charges rates none of them can pay, and my uncle's estate, which I now hold, has a considerable interest in seeing those goods delivered, since half of what those families are carrying was purchased on credit against this very store. You want me to guide them? I want you to guide them, because every man in this town tells me you are the only scout who has taken a loaded wagon through that pass and lost neither wagon nor life doing it, and because if those goods do not arrive, the debts owed to this store will never be collected, and I have no intention of losing my uncle's investment to an early snowstorm. And in exchange, Charlotte said, closing the ledger with a small definitive click, I will credit the value of your labor and your knowledge of the past directly against the note you owe me. A fair wage, calculated by the day, applied dollar for dollar. It will not clear your debt entirely, but it will go a long way toward it, and it will do more good for both of us than you glaring at me from a hayloft for the next 6 months. Theodore studied her over the rim of the coffee cup. She had, he thought, a way of making a business transaction sound like the only sensible thing in the world, when what she was actually asking him to do was ride through the most dangerous pass in the territory in weather that could turn to blizzard in an hour, with a train of families who had likely never driven oxen before setting out from Missouri. "You know nothing about that pass," he said. "You have never seen it." "I have read the survey reports my uncle kept. I have spoken to 3 men who crossed it in better seasons than this one, and I have priced the alternative, which is the Kane Toll Road, at $4 a wagon plus a toll on every head of stock, a rate that would beggar every family sitting at that ranch. I know a great deal about that pass, Mr. Calloway. I simply have not stood in it. That is what I am hiring you for." "Hiring me," he repeated. "Yes, with my own money. With the estate's money, which is presently mine to direct, and which I am directing toward getting those wagons through before winter kills 12 families' worth of children for want of flour. Do you have an objection to the arrangement, or only to the fact that it is a woman making it?" The question landed sharper than he expected, and he set the coffee cup down slowly. "I have crossed that pass 4 times," he said. "Once in October like this, twice in summer, once in a freak spring blizzard that I do not care to discuss. Every one of those times I was the only person deciding where the wagons went. If I do this, I make the calls on the trail. Not you, not the fathers with the loudest voices, me." "Agreed," Charlotte said, without hesitation, and something in the speed of her agreement told him she had expected the demand and had already decided to grant it. "I would not presume to argue mountain craft with a mountain man, Mr. Calloway. I only ask that you extend me the same courtesy regarding contracts and debts, since apparently neither of us believes the other capable of doing his job." For the first time since he had ridden into town, Theodore felt the corner of his mouth twitch toward a smile. "I never said you weren't capable," he said. "I said you didn't know the pass." "And I never said you were incapable of paying a debt," Charlotte said. "I said you hadn't paid it yet. There is a difference, and I would thank you to notice it." She was, he thought, riding back to the livery that afternoon to collect his gear, entirely too pleased with her own reasoning, and entirely too accustomed to winning arguments through the sheer weight of being right. It would have been easier to dislike her if she had been wrong about anything at all. The Ashcroft Ranch sat in a wide bowl of yellowed grass with the Sangre de Cristo Range rising blue and white-capped behind it. And when Theodore and Charlotte rode in together 2 days later, the families gathered there looked at them with the particular wariness of people who had already been disappointed once that season by a scout who had taken their advance payment and vanished toward Santa Fe. There were 12 wagons, heavy Studebaker freighters loaded with flour sacks and seed grain and crates of medicine, bound for the mining camps and mountain settlements beyond Wolf Tooth Pass. And among them, a schoolteacher named Miss Ruth Danvers, who had signed on to open a school in one of those settlements come spring, and would not see a single student if the wagons did not arrive with enough food to survive the winter first. "You are the scout," said a broad-shouldered man named Amos Feeney, stepping forward with the air of a man who had appointed himself spokesman for the group. "And who is the lady? No offense meant, ma'am, but this is not a journey for delicate company." "Charlotte Wilcox," Charlotte said, before Theodore could answer. "I hold the note on the goods half of you are carrying on credit, Mr. Feeney, which makes this my concern as much as yours, and I intend to see it through to the far side of that mountain. As for delicacy, I crossed the Mississippi in a flatboat in a spring flood and negotiated a fair price on flour with 3 separate merchants who each tried to cheat me blind, so I believe I will manage a mountain trail." A ripple of surprised laughter went through the gathered families, and Amos Feeney's ears went red, and Theodore, watching from horseback, found himself biting back a grin he had no business feeling. "We leave at first light," he said, before the moment could stretch further. "Every wagon gets checked tonight, axles and wheel rims and yokes, because I am not stopping to fix a broken axle in the middle of a switchback with snow coming. Water the stock heavy tonight. They will not get another good drink until we are through the worst of it. And anyone who has a rifle they do not know how to use, learn tonight, because there are wolves in that high country hungry enough this time of year to come at oxen in the dark." The families dispersed to their wagons, and Charlotte fell into step beside him as he walked the line checking wheels. "You did not correct me back there," she said, "about this being my concern as much as theirs." "You weren't wrong," Theodore said, crouching to inspect a wheel rim gone loose at the hub, "though I'll thank you not to make a habit of answering questions put to me. He asked who I was. I answered for myself. I did not answer for you. You've got a sharp tongue for a lady who spent 11 days in this territory." "I have spent 27 years learning that a woman who does not speak for herself is spoken over," Charlotte said. "And I did not travel 2,000 miles to start being quiet now, Mr. Calloway." He looked up at her, at the firelight from a nearby camp catching the line of her jaw, and thought that whatever else this woman was, she was not going to be easy to ignore, and he was no longer entirely certain he wanted to. They set out before dawn the next morning, 12 wagons in a line with Theodore riding point and Charlotte driving her uncle's old spring wagon near the middle of the train, close enough to consult with the families about their loads, far enough back that Theodore could keep an eye on her without it looking. He told himself, like he was keeping an eye on her. The first 2 days were easy going, the trail climbing gradually through pinon and juniper into stands of ponderosa pine, the air growing sharper and thinner with every mile, the peaks ahead going from blue to white as they closed the distance. It was on the third day, with the trail narrowing to skirt the edge of a boulder field above a dry wash, that the danger Theodore had been watching for finally showed itself, though not from the mountain at all. He heard it before he saw it, a shifting scrape of stone from above the trail, and some old instinct sharpened by years he did not like to discuss sent him wheeling his horse around and shouting for the lead wagon to halt, just as a slide of loose scree came pouring down the slope, dislodged by something or someone above. The lead oxen spooked, bawling and lunging sideways against their yokes, and the wagon lurched toward the edge of the wash where the trail crumbled away into a 10-foot drop of broken rock. Charlotte was out of her own wagon and running before Theodore had fully registered what was happening, sprinting toward the panicking team with her skirts gathered in one fist, and she caught the lead ox's headstall with both hands just as the wheel closest to the drop found nothing but air beneath it. Charlotte. Theodore was off his horse and moving, but she was already there, hauling the ox's head around with a strength that startled him, digging her heels into the loose ground and shouting words at the animal that were not remotely ladylike. And between her weight on the headstall and the ox's own instinct to turn away from the drop, the team came around just enough that the wagon settled back onto solid trail with a bone-jarring crack of the axle, but all 4 wheels on the ground. Theodore reached her a half-second later, catching her by the shoulders as the last of the scree rattled down around them, and for one long moment neither of them said anything at all, his hands gripping her arms, her chest heaving, both of them staring at the drop the wagon had nearly gone over. "You could have been killed," he said, when he found his voice, and it came out rougher than he intended. "So could you," Charlotte said, "and so could that family's children who are sitting in the back of that wagon right now, and someone had to move, so I moved. That's not scouting sense, he stopped himself. That's what Mr. Calloway, reckless, foolish. The instinct of a woman who does not know when to stay out of the way. That's the fastest anyone's caught a spooked ox team I've seen in 10 years of guiding wagons," he said instead, and watched surprise and then something warmer chase across her face. "I was going to say brave. I don't hand that word out easy." "Oh," Charlotte said, and for once she seemed to have nothing else to add. Above them on the ridge, Theodore's eyes caught a flash of movement, a rider withdrawing into the trees, too far and too quick to identify, and the sour certainty settled into his gut that the rockslide had not been an accident of loose stone and autumn frost. Someone had started that slide on purpose and timed it to the wagon train's passing. He said nothing of it to the families that night, not wanting to spread panic through a group already frightened of the mountain itself, but he told Charlotte, once the camp had gone quiet and the fires burned low. "Someone was up on that ridge," he said, crouched beside her small fire with a tin cup of coffee going cold in his hand. "Started that slide on purpose. I'd bet my saddle on it." "Kane," Charlotte said immediately, and when he raised an eyebrow she went on. "Silas Kane owns the toll road through the low pass, and he has made no secret of resenting every wagon that goes around his gate instead of through it. My uncle's papers show he has been buying up grazing leases and mining claims all through this valley for 2 years, quietly, through 3 different names, and consolidating control of every route in and out of these mountains except this one. If 12 families make it through Wolf Tooth Pass without paying his toll, that is 12 families who will tell every other family in the territory it can be done. That's a long way to travel for spite," Theodore said. "It is not spite," Charlotte said. "It is business." A man who controls the only road through a mountain range controls every price on every good that crosses it, and every settlement on the far side becomes dependent on him for flour, salt, tools, everything. That is worth a great deal more than the toll on 12 wagons, Mr. Calloway. That is worth an empire. You know a great deal about Silas Kane's business for a woman who's been in this territory 11 days. Charlotte was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire, and when she spoke again her voice had dropped, careful in a way he had not heard from her before. My uncle did not simply hold notes and run a dry goods interest, Mr. Calloway. In his last months he was compiling evidence, ledgers and letters, showing that Silas Kane had been forging land claims along this pass, filing false witness statements to push settlers off grants they held fair and square, and in one case, paying men to burn a homestead rather than contest it in court. My uncle intended to bring that evidence before the Territorial Land Office this winter. He died before he could. I found the papers in his strongbox the week I arrived, and I have told exactly one other living person that I have them. Who? You, Charlotte said, meeting his eyes across the fire. Just now. The weight of that settled between them, heavier than the cold coming down off the mountain. That's not a thing you should be carrying alone, Theodore said finally. I am not alone, Charlotte said. I have a scout who apparently does not hand out the word brave lightly, and who has just been informed, free of charge, that guiding my wagon train may also mean guiding a moving target. If you would like to renegotiate your wages in light of that information, I would understand. I don't renegotiate a deal for a little added danger, Theodore said. I've faced worse for less reason. What reason is this, then? He looked at her for a long moment, the firelight warm on her face, her dark hair come loose from its pins after the long day's ride, and he found himself wanting to tell her things he had told no one in this territory, about the years before he was Theodore Calloway of Pinon Gap, when he had ridden with men whose names still hung wanted posters in 3 counties, and how he had walked away from that life with nothing but the clothes on his back and a determination never to be that man again. The reason, he said instead, choosing the safer half of the truth, is that 12 families are trusting me to get them through that mountain alive, and I have never once broken that kind of trust, and I don't intend to start on account of Silas Kane's greed. Charlotte studied him for a moment, as though she had heard the words he had not said as clearly as the ones he had, and did not press. Then we understand each other, she said, and held out her hand, and he shook it, and told himself the warmth that traveled up his arm at the contact was nothing more than proximity to the fire. The trail climbed harder over the following 2 days, the pines giving way to bare rock and stunted alpine growth, the air cold enough now that breath hung visible before every face, and the families grew quieter, saving their strength for the walking most of them now did beside their wagons to spare the straining oxen. Charlotte proved, to Theodore's continued and reluctant surprise, entirely unafraid of hard work. She walked beside the wagons like everyone else, helped a young mother named Serafini nurse a sick child through a rough night with willow bark tea and a steady voice, and when a wagon wheel finally gave out on the 4th day, she was the one who produced, from her own trunk, a coil of good hemp rope and a set of tools her uncle had apparently insisted she carry, and helped Theodore rig a temporary splint to the cracked wheel that held for another 20 miles. You keep surprising me, Theodore admitted, wiping grease from his hands as they worked side by side under the wagon. I had you pegged, that first morning, for a fine lady who'd never held anything heavier than a fan. And I had you pegged, Charlotte said, passing him the wrench before he asked for it, an easy coordination that had grown between them without either commenting on it. For a man who could not read past his own name, given how carefully you had my uncle go through that note twice. Theodore's hand stilled on the wheel. You knew that. My uncle mentioned it, not unkindly. He said you asked good questions, sharper than most men who claimed to read fine. Charlotte's voice was gentle now, none of its usual sharpness. I did not think less of you for it, Mr. Calloway. I have met men with a university education who could not tell a fair contract from a swindle. Reading and understanding are not the same skill, and you have the second in greater measure than most. Most folks don't see it that way. Most folks, Charlotte said, have never had to survive by their wits in a country that would as soon kill them as look at them. I imagine you have. He did not answer that directly, but something eased in his chest all the same. Some old defended place he had not realized he was still guarding, and he handed her back the wrench with fingers that lingered a moment longer than necessary against hers. That night, camped in a stand of wind-bent pines below the final approach to the pass, Theodore found Charlotte sitting apart from the main fires, wrapped in a blanket, looking up at a sky gone thick with more stars than she had ever seen over St. Louis. "Trouble sleeping?" he asked, settling down beside her without waiting for invitation, a familiarity that would have been unthinkable between them a week before. "I keep thinking about the ledgers," Charlotte admitted. "About what happens once we are through this pass, and the evidence has to be brought before a magistrate. Silas Kane has money enough to buy silence in most courts in this territory. I do not know that my uncle's papers, however damning, will be enough." "They will be enough if there's a witness willing to stand behind them," Theodore said. "You said yourself you're the only living person who's seen them." "I am. Which is precisely why I suspect the rockslide was no accident, Mr. Calloway. If I do not reach the far side of this mountain, those papers stay locked in a strongbox forever, and Silas Kane keeps his empire." "Then you'll reach the far side," Theodore said, with a certainty that surprised even him. "I gave you my word I'd get this train through, and that word covers you same as it covers every family back there. You barely knew me 11 days ago." "I barely know you now," Theodore admitted, "except that you ran head first at a spooked ox team without thinking twice, and you've walked every mile of this trail instead of riding easy in your wagon, and you carry your uncle's fight like it's your own even though nobody would blame you for handing the whole mess to a lawyer and going home to St. Louis. That's enough knowing for me to give my word and mean it." Charlotte turned to look at him then, and in the starlight her face had softened into something unguarded, something he had not seen from her since the moment he first found her on his porch. "Nobody has ever put it to me quite that way," she said quietly. "Most men I have known wanted me quiet and grateful, not carrying anything at all." "Then most men you've known were fools," Theodore said, "and I'd tell them so to their faces." "Would you?" "I would." He held her gaze close enough now in the small space of shared blanket warmth that he could see the flecks of gold in the brown of her eyes catching starlight. "Charlotte, I meant to dislike you. Standing on my porch with my desk in the grass, I meant to dislike you thoroughly and for a long while. And now? Now I find I'm having considerable trouble managing it." Charlotte laughed, soft and surprised, a sound he wanted very badly to hear again, and for a moment neither of them moved, the space between them charged with something neither was quite ready to name, until a coyote's cry echoing off the rocks broke the spell and sent them both, a little sheepishly, back toward the safety of their separate fires. The pass itself, when they reached it the following afternoon, was every bit as fearsome as its reputation. Wolf Tooth Pass earned its name from twin spires of gray granite flanking a narrow saddle of trail barely wide enough for a single wagon, with a drop on the northern side plunging 400 feet to a rushing river below. And Theodore walked the whole train through on foot, leading each team by hand, one wagon at a time, while the families waited in a tense, silent line behind. It took the better part of a day to bring all 12 wagons through the narrowest stretch, and by the time the last wagon cleared the saddle and the trail widened again into a long descending valley, the light was failing and everyone, Theodore included, was gray with exhaustion. They camped that night within sight of the pass they had conquered, and for the first time since leaving the Ashcroft Ranch, something like celebration moved through the camp. A fiddle produced from someone's wagon, voices raised in a ragged hymn of thanksgiving, children laughing for the first time in days. Charlotte sat near the largest fire with a tin cup of coffee, watching the families she had helped save, and when Theodore settled beside her, she leaned, without quite seeming to decide to do it, until her shoulder rested against his. "We did it," she said. "You did," Theodore said. "I just know the trail. You're the one who made sure there was anything left to guide through it." "We did it," she said again, more firmly, and turned her face up to his. And in the firelight, with the fiddle music drifting between the wagons and the stars wheeling bright and cold overhead, Theodore Calloway leaned down and kissed Charlotte Wilcox, soft and questioning at first, and then with a certainty that startled them both when she kissed him back. "I still hold the note on your store," she murmured against his mouth, a little breathless, when they finally parted. "I still mean to pay it," he said, "though I confess I'm no longer in quite such a hurry to see the arrangement end." The morning brought a rider up the valley trail at a hard gallop, and Theodore was on his feet with a rifle in hand before the man had fully reined in, recognizing him after a moment as one of the young hands from the Ashcroft ranch, sent ahead days before with letters for the settlements beyond the pass. "Mr. Calloway," the young man gasped, half falling from his horse. "There's men in Pinon Gap asking after Miss Wilcox. Rough men, 3 of them, offering money for word of where she's headed. Sheriff Dolan ran them off once, but they're camped outside town, and there's talk of a bounty, $500, for anyone who brings her back or brings word of where she can be found." Charlotte had gone pale, her hand tightening on the coffee cup until her knuckles whitened. $500, she said. "That is a fortune in this territory. That is not a bounty a man places lightly." "That's Kane," Theodore said grimly. "Has to be. Someone's told him what you're carrying." "Or someone suspects it," Charlotte said. "My guardian, Mr. Prout, knew I had gone through my uncle's papers before I left for Pinon Gap. He is not a dishonest man, but he is not a careful one either, and if Silas Kane came asking questions with money in hand, I would not put it past him to answer without fully understanding what he was giving away." "Prout," Theodore repeated. "Your uncle's business partner. Appointed as my guardian in my uncle's will, for whatever legal protection that was meant to afford me," Charlotte said, with a bitterness Theodore had not heard from her before. "A kind man, and hopelessly unequal to Silas Kane in a negotiation. I have managed my own affairs since I was 19 years old, Mr. Calloway, because Ashford Prout could be talked out of a sound contract by anyone with a confident voice and a fine coat, and Silas Kane, I am quite sure, owns several fine coats. Then he doesn't just want the pass shut down," Theodore said slowly, putting the pieces together aloud. "He wants you silenced before you can bring those ledgers anywhere near a magistrate. This isn't about tolls anymore." "No," Charlotte agreed. "It is about a man protecting a forged land claim, a burned homestead, and however many other crimes my uncle's papers might show, by any means available to him. And apparently he now believes $500 is a reasonable price for my silence." Theodore stood, checking the rifle's action with hands gone hard and certain, all the warmth of the night before settling into something colder and more purposeful. "Then we don't go back through Pinon Gap," he said. "We deliver these wagons to the settlements on schedule like we promised these families, and then you and I ride for the Territorial Land Office in Cimarron directly, before word of that bounty spreads any further than 3 men outside a mountain town. That's another 4 days' ride from the far settlements," Charlotte said. "Through country I don't know." "Country I do," Theodore said. "You said it yourself back on my porch. I know this trail better than any man in the territory. I'm not leaving your side until those papers are in a magistrate's hands, and Silas Kane is answering for every one of them." Something in the flat certainty of his voice made Charlotte look at him a long moment, searching his face for the reservation she half expected to find and not finding it. "You barely know what you're volunteering for," she said quietly. "A $500 bounty draws every desperate man in 3 counties, Theodore. This will not be safe." It was the first time she had used his given name, and it landed somewhere in his chest with more force than the bounty itself. "I know exactly what I'm volunteering for," he said. "I told you already. I don't break my word, Charlotte, and my word's not just to those families back there anymore. It's to you." The wagon train reached the first of the mountain settlements 2 days later, a cluster of cabins and a half-built church called Rio Verde, and the joy that met them there, families weeping openly at the sight of flour sacks and seed grain that would see them through the winter, was enough to remind even Charlotte, in the midst of her fear, why the journey had mattered in the first place. They delivered the second load to a mining camp further along the valley, and the third and final wagons to a settlement called Alta Vista, perched high against the mountain's western face. And by the time the last flour sack was unloaded, the families who had traveled with them for 8 hard days were already speaking of Theodore Calloway and Charlotte Wilcox as though they were something like local legend, the scout and the merchant who had brought the impossible past to heal. But there was no time to linger in the warmth of that gratitude. Within the hour, Theodore had traded his tired horse for a fresh one from the Alta Vista corral, secured a second mount for Charlotte, and the two of them set out south and east towards Cimarron, the territorial seat where the land office and a magistrate with a reputation for honesty both could be found, carrying between them a leather satchel containing Ezra Wilcox's ledgers, 3 sworn letters, and a hand-drawn map showing the pattern of Silas Kane's false land claims across 2 counties. They rode hard through country turning bitter with the season's first true cold, camping only when the horses demanded it, and it was on the second night of that ride, huddled close around a small fire in a rocky draw with the wind screaming overhead, that Theodore finally told Charlotte the truth he had been carrying since Pinon Gap. "There's something you should know," he said, staring into the flames rather than at her, "about who I was before I came to this territory." Charlotte waited, saying nothing, giving him the space to find the words. "I rode with a gang out of the Texas Panhandle for the better part of 3 years, he said. "Cattle mostly, some horse theft, once a bank in a town I won't name because I'm still ashamed enough of it not to want it spoken aloud. I wasn't the worst of them, but I wasn't innocent either. I killed a man in a robbery gone wrong when I was 22, not meaning to, but dead is dead regardless of meaning. I got out when the gang splintered after a marshal in Amarillo shot 2 of my friends dead in the street, and I rode north with nothing but a horse and a decision that I was done being that man. Theodore Calloway is my true name, my given name, the one my mother called me. But for 3 years I went by another name entirely while I did things that name would have shamed her to hear of. I came to Pinon Gap 5 years ago and built that store honest, dollar by dollar, and I have not touched a stolen thing since, but I thought you should know it, before this ride takes us any further, because if Silas Kane or the men chasing that bounty dig deep enough, they may find that old name and use it against both of us." Charlotte was quiet for a long moment, and Theodore made himself meet her eyes, bracing for whatever judgment might come. "Did you pay for the man you killed?" she asked finally, "in whatever way this territory allows a man to pay." "There was no charge ever brought," Theodore said. "It happened in chaos in the dark, and no one could say for certain whose bullet did it, but I've carried it every day since, and I don't imagine I'll stop." "Then you have paid," Charlotte said, "in the coin that matters most, which is the changing of a man's whole life. I am a merchant's niece, Theodore, not a magistrate. I do not deal in old sins. I deal in whether a man's word is good today, and whether his hands are steady when a wheel needs mending or an ox needs catching, and whether he looks a frightened woman in the eye and tells her he will not leave her side, and means it. You have shown me all of that in the space of 10 days. I'm not going to unlearn it because of a name you no longer use." Theodore let out a breath he had not realized he was holding, and reached across the small fire to take her hand, and she let him. "I have never told anyone that," he said, "not in 5 years. "I am glad you told me," Charlotte said simply. "I would rather love a man who has been honest about his worst than one who has hidden it from me only to have it surface later, uglier for the hiding." "Love," Theodore repeated softly. Charlotte's cheeks colored, but she did not look away. "I did not misspeak." "No," Theodore said, drawing her closer across the narrow space. "I don't believe you did, and he kissed her again there in the firelight, slower this time, surer, both of them understanding now exactly what was being promised between them. They reached the crossing of the Cimarron River on the third morning, swollen and violent, with the runoff of an early mountain storm that had dumped heavy snow in the high country 2 days before, the water running brown and furious over the rope and plank crossing that locals had strung between 2 cottonwood trunks the previous spring. It was not the sturdiest crossing under the best of conditions, and the conditions this morning were far from the best. "We could wait it out," Charlotte said, eyeing the roaring water with open apprehension. "Find a ford further up or down." "We don't have the days to spare," Theodore said grimly, dismounting to inspect the rope crossing, testing the tension of the guide lines strung above the plank walkway. "Kane's men could already be ahead of us if word of our route got back to Pinon Gap. Every hour we lose is an hour he has to bury evidence or buy off the magistrate." It was as they debated the crossing that the first sign of pursuit reached them, 3 riders appearing on the ridge behind, still distant but closing at a hard trot, and Theodore recognized, even at that range, the description the young hand from Ashcroft Ranch had given of the Bounty men. "That settles it," he said. "We cross now." The plank walkway groaned under Theodore's weight as he led his horse across first, testing each board, one hand gripping the guide rope strung shoulder-high between the cottonwoods, the river snarling and clawing at the underside of the crossing not 4 feet below. He made it to the far bank and turned to guide Charlotte across, calling instructions over the roar of the water. She was halfway across, her horse skittish and unwilling on the shifting planks, when the first board splintered beneath the animal's rear hoof with a crack loud enough to hear over the river, and the horse reared in panic, nearly pitching Charlotte into the flood. Charlotte! Theodore was already moving, unspooling the coil of rope from his saddle with hands that had done this kind of work before, in circumstances he did not care to remember, tying off one end to the sturdy cottonwood on his own bank with a knot that would hold a falling mountain. "Get off the horse," he shouted. "Grab the guide rope, hand over hand, leave the horse." Charlotte, to her enormous credit, did not hesitate or argue, sliding from the saddle even as the horse screamed and bucked beside her, catching the shoulder-high guide rope with both hands just as another plank gave way beneath her boots, the walkway now missing 2 boards in the middle of its span, the gap widening with each surge of the current battering its supports. "I'm coming to you," Theodore called, already stepping back onto the crumbling walkway with his own rope looped and ready. "No," Charlotte's voice cracked with effort and fear, but held its clarity even now, that same unbreakable steadiness. "If you come out here, the whole crossing might go under both our weights." "Throw me the rope, Theodore, I can catch it." He hesitated only a heartbeat, every instinct screaming at him to close the distance himself, and then trusted her, exactly as she had asked him to, and hurled the coiled rope across the gap with all the strength in his arm. It sailed true, uncoiling in the wind, and Charlotte released one hand from the guide rope just long enough to snatch the thrown rope from the air, wrapping it twice around her wrist and fist the way he had shown families to do days before when fording lesser streams. "Now walk," Theodore shouted. "Toward me, slow. Let the rope take your weight if a board gives." The riders behind them had reached the top of the ridge now, close enough that Theodore could hear one of them shout something lost to the wind and the river's roar, and he did not spare them a glance, every fiber of his attention locked on Charlotte's careful, agonizing progress across the disintegrating crossing, plank by plank, the river tearing hungrily at the structure beneath her feet. 3 feet from the gap where the boards had already fallen, the crossing gave way entirely beneath her, both remaining planks in that section splintering at once and dropping into the churning water, and Charlotte fell with a cry that stopped Theodore's heart cold. But the rope held, her wrist wrenched hard by the sudden drop, her body swinging out over the roaring current with only that line in Theodore's grip on the far end standing between her and the river. "I have you," Theodore roared, hauling the rope hand over hand with every ounce of strength he possessed, digging his heels into the muddy bank. And Charlotte, soaked to the chest and gasping from the cold shock of the spray, found footing on a submerged rock and pushed herself up even as he pulled, the two of them working together across the impossible distance until her hand found the solid wood of the near bank's support post, and Theodore's arms closed around her, dragging her the last several feet onto solid ground. They collapsed together on the frost-hardened bank, Charlotte shaking with cold and reaction, Theodore holding her so tightly it was as though he meant to fuse them together by will alone, both of them soaked and gasping, the crossing behind them now nothing but two broken cottonwood posts and a snapped guide rope trailing uselessly into the water. "You're all right," Theodore said, again and again into her wet hair, his voice raw. "You're all right, I have you, you're all right." "I told you I could catch the rope," Charlotte managed, half laughing, half sobbing with the release of terror. "And you doubted me for a whole half a second, Theodore Calloway. I saw it in your face." "I will never doubt you again," he said fiercely, pulling back only far enough to look at her to cup her cold face in his hands. "Not for half a second, not for the rest of my life, do you hear me?" "I hear you," Charlotte whispered, and then the sound of the pursuing riders, now audible even over the river, reached them both, and the moment of relief hardened instantly into readiness. "They can't cross," Theodore said, coming to his feet and pulling Charlotte up with him, both of them looking back across the water at the three riders now reining in on the far bank, staring at the ruined crossing with open frustration. "Not without losing an hour finding another ford. That buys us time." One of the riders, a heavy-set man in a black coat, cupped his hands and shouted across the roaring water, his words fragmented by distance and wind but unmistakable in their threat. "Miss Wilcox, Mr. Kane only wants to talk business. There's no need for any of this trouble." "Tell Mr. Kane," Charlotte shouted back, her voice somehow carrying clear and hard across the river despite everything her body had just endured, "that I will be very glad to discuss business with him, in front of a territorial magistrate, with my uncle's ledgers as the agenda." The rider's face, even at that distance, showed his displeasure at the answer, and after a moment's consultation with his companions, the three of them wheeled their horses and rode north along the bank, presumably searching for another crossing. "They'll find one eventually," Theodore said, already moving toward where their horses had wandered downstream, Charlotte's mount having thankfully caught itself on a gravel bar rather than being swept away. "But it buys us the better part of a day. Come on, Cimarron's still a hard ride from here, and I want you out of those wet clothes and by a fire before you catch your death, magistrate or no magistrate." They reached Cimarron by the following evening, exhausted, saddle-sore and travel-worn, but alive and with the satchel of evidence still dry and intact where Theodore had wrapped it in oilcloth before the river crossing. The Territorial Land Office occupied a squat adobe building near the plaza, and the magistrate, a deliberate, gray-bearded man named Judge Corwin Ashby, listened to Charlotte's account and reviewed Ezra Wilcox's ledgers with the careful, unhurried thoroughness of a man who had seen too many false claims to be rushed by anyone's urgency. "This is a serious accusation," Judge Ashby said finally, setting down the last of the papers, "forgery of land claims, subornation of false witness statements, and if this letter is to be believed, arson resulting in the destruction of a homestead. Silas Kane is not a man without influence in this territory, Miss Wilcox. He has friends in Santa Fe, and he will not go quietly." "I am aware of that, Your Honor," Charlotte said. "He has already placed a bounty of $500 on my whereabouts and attempted, twice now, to prevent me from reaching this office at all. I would ask the court's protection, and I would ask that these documents be examined without delay before Mr. Kane has further opportunity to buy silence or destroy remaining evidence." Judge Ashby's gaze moved to Theodore, standing close behind Charlotte's chair, and something in his weathered face sharpened with recognition. "You're the scout who brought that Ashcroft wagon train through Wolf Tooth Pass," he said. Word of that reached town 2 days ahead of you, Mr. Calloway. 12 families singing your praises to anyone who will listen. Just doing the job I was hired for, Your Honor, Theodore said. Seems to me you did considerably more than that, the judge said, given the state of your traveling companion's clothing and the story she just told me about a river crossing. I'll issue a warrant for Silas Kane's appearance before this office within the week, on the strength of this evidence, and I will send word to the Territorial Marshal's office to look into the matter of that bounty as an attempt to obstruct testimony in a land fraud case, which is itself a serious offense under territorial law. In the meantime, Miss Wilcox, Mr. Calloway, I would suggest you both remain here in Cimarron, under the protection of the Marshal's office, until this matter is settled. Silas Kane is a desperate man now, and desperate men do foolish things. The warning proved prescient. 3 days later, as the Territorial Marshal's deputies rode out to serve the summons at Kane's ranch outside Pinon Gap, word came back that Kane had already fled north toward the Colorado line with what cash and papers he could gather, abandoning the toll road operation and the bulk of his fraudulently claimed land in his haste. He was apprehended 11 days later by Colorado authorities acting on the Territorial Marshal's telegraphed description, attempting to sell a string of horses under a false name in Trinidad, and was returned to New Mexico Territory to stand before Judge Ashby on charges that would, in the end, see him sentenced to 15 years in the Territorial Prison at Santa Fe for land fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to obstruct justice, though the arson charge, lacking a living witness to the fire itself, could not be proven to the judge's satisfaction and was ultimately set aside. Ashford Prout, Charlotte's guardian, was called before the same court to answer for his role in revealing her whereabouts, and proved, as Charlotte had predicted, to be more foolish than criminal, having been thoroughly deceived by one of Kane's associates into believing he was merely helping a legitimate business inquiry locate a young woman traveling alone in dangerous country. Judge Ashby, satisfied that Prout's error had been one of naivety rather than malice, declined to press charges, though he did, at Charlotte's own insistence, formally release Prout from his guardianship duties, on the grounds, as the judge's order drily put it, that Miss Wilcox had demonstrated conclusively over the preceding weeks that she required no guardian whatsoever. It was 3 weeks after that, with the first heavy snows finally closing Wolf Tooth Pass for the winter and Silas Kane's forfeited land claims reverting, by order of the Territorial Land Office, to the settlers he had cheated, that Theodore Calloway stood once more on the porch of his trading post in Pinon Gap, this time with Charlotte Wilcox beside him rather than across a legal divide, both of them looking at the desk that had once sat in the frosted grass and now stood back inside where it belonged. "I paid the note," Theodore said, holding up a folded receipt with something like wonder in his voice. "Every dollar of it, between the wages you credited me for the Wagon train and the reward the Territorial Land Office paid out for information leading to Kane's fraudulent claims. I own this store free and clear for the first time in 4 years." "You do," Charlotte agreed, "though I confess I have grown rather fond of standing behind that counter these past weeks, adding columns of figures and telling customers precisely why the price of flour is what it is, and I find myself in no great hurry to give up the practice." "Then don't," Theodore said. "I never had a head for the numbers side of the business anyway, not the way you do. I know freight and trail and how to read a mountain's moods before a storm hits. You know contracts and prices, and how to keep an honest man from being cheated by a dishonest one. Seems to me those two things fit together better than either one alone." "Are you offering me a business partnership, Mr. Calloway?" Charlotte asked, though the warmth in her voice suggested she suspected he was offering something considerably more than that. "I'm offering you whatever you'll have," Theodore said, turning to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. "Partnership, if that's what you want to call it today. But I'll tell you plainly, Charlotte Wilcox, I have not stopped thinking about that fire the night you first told me you loved me, and about the way you looked coming up out of that river soaked through and still laughing, and about every single day since, in which I have found some new reason to be glad you took possession of my store instead of some banker in Santa Fe I'd never have had cause to fall in love with. I am not a rich man, and I carry a past I'm not proud of, but I love you with everything decent I have left in me, and I am asking you plainly to marry me, and to make this store and this town and whatever comes after it ours together, not yours and not mine." Charlotte's eyes had gone bright, and she did not make him wait for an answer. "I have negotiated a great many contracts in my life, Theodore Calloway," she said, "and I have never once signed one so readily as I intend to accept this proposal. Yes. Yes, I will marry you, and I will keep your ledgers, and you will keep me safe on every mountain trail either of us ever crosses again. And between the two of us, I do not believe there is a pass in this territory, possible or impossible, that we could not find our way through." He kissed her there on the porch of the store that had first brought them together in confrontation, and now stood as the foundation of everything ahead of them. And when they finally parted, Pinyon Gap's small Main Street had gathered a modest audience of amused onlookers, including Sheriff Dolan and old Sanchez from the livery, who called out a hearty congratulations that sent color rushing to Charlotte's cheeks, even as she laughed and waved them off with the easy confidence of a woman entirely at home, at last, in the life she had found for herself in this rugged, beautiful, unforgiving country. They married in December, in a small ceremony at the half-built church in Rio Verde, the settlement whose winter stores their wagon train had saved, with Miss Ruth Danvers playing a borrowed fiddle and Sarah Feeney's children scattering wildflowers gathered from the last warm pocket of the season, and Ashford Prout, invited despite everything, weeping openly with relief and pride as he gave Charlotte away, having, in the month since his release from guardianship, become something like a proud and grateful uncle to them both. The trading post in Pinyon Gap prospered through that winter and the spring that followed, its ledgers kept with meticulous precision by Charlotte Calloway, its freight and trail business guided with unmatched skill by her husband. And when the following autumn came and the wagon trains once more gathered at the base of Wolf Tooth Pass, racing to beat the snow, it was Theodore Calloway who rode out to guide them, and Charlotte Calloway who rode beside him every step of the way, not because anyone required it of her, but because neither of them, having once found the surest footing of their lives in each other, saw any reason ever to travel separately again.